Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Sandeep, for inviting us and hosting this conference. I'm so happy that the smallest topic is the last one, and this is on China, and there are a lot of developments there, the trade war, the slowdown in Chinese economy. In my talk, I will mention trade war, but I won't focus on trade war. I'll be happy to get into trade war during the Q&A. What I want to do is to describe the China growth model, otherwise known as state capitalism, and to make sure that I get this out. What I want to say is that the heyday of, in my own belief, the heyday of state capitalism is about to be over. And the evidence is fairly clear now that the slowdown is happening. And the most concerning development has been not just GDP slowdown, and later on I'm going to show you some research that cast doubt on Chinese statistics in the first place. But it's not just the economic slowdown, it is the underlying strength of the Chinese economy, which is built on productivity growth, and the numbers on productivity growth is showing weaknesses, right? Despite all these investments in infrastructure, in the things that we hear about, Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. So a lot of technology, a lot of innovations, and yet they don't show up in the productivity contributions to GDP. In fact, the productivity growth is slowing down substantially. But I want to take you back to the history of the Chinese growth model, and what are the accomplishments and what are the weaknesses of this model, and then understand the Trump shock in that context. And this is why Trump shock matters, because it is happening when the state capitalism is no longer performing as it was before. So let me just sort of go over the agenda of my presentation. I'm first going to describe two ways of looking at Chinese economic growth models. One is known as market capitalism, and the other is known as state capitalism. Among academics, there has been a long debate which model describes China better than the other model. But I think the evidence now is super clear that state capitalism is a more accurate description of Chinese growth model. Then I'm going to talk about the politics of state capitalism. One of the characteristics of state capitalism is this bundling of economics and politics. Right? In the US, sometimes we can separate the two. In China, it is extremely difficult to separate politics from economics. And then I'm going to talk about the economics of state capitalism, the governance of state capitalism, and speculate about prospects. Right? So that's the agenda for my presentation. There used to be an academic consensus about China, and the consensus goes something like this. Today, China is already a fundamentally market economy. Right? If you look at the private sector share of the GDP and the price flexibility, China got there through what is known as gradualism, right? So essentially, reforms happen in small steps, but they happen incrementally and sequentially. First you do agriculture, then you do industry. First you do internal reforms, then external reforms. Those of you who may remember the big debate going back to the 1990s about shock therapy vis-a-vis gradualism, in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries, there was a model of doing everything together, right, at the same time. China is known for doing these things incrementally and sequentially. And China won the debate on gradualism vis-a-vis shock therapy in terms of both the effectiveness of the reform model and in terms of the durability. The other component of the consensus is politics is endogenous. I mean, endogenous is a fancy term basically saying that it is a function of something else, right? Basically, the idea there is Chinese politics is a function of economics, right? Chinese are economic animals, and the leaders only care about the GDP. Economics determines everything. So that's one view of political endogeneity. The other view is that, and this is sort of going back to Bill Clinton's rationale for getting China into the WTO. The rationale there is what is known as engagement, right? As GDP grows to reach a certain level, and social scientists believe that level to be about $10,000 per capita GDP, the country typically tip to the other side, from authoritarian side to the democratic side. So essentially, politics is a function of economic development. So these are the components of the consensus, and they held until Mr. Xi came along, right? And I don't know many of you who will remember he came in 2013, and since he came into power, he has engineered many, many changes to the Chinese politics, to Chinese economy. He abolished the one institutional limitation on his power, which is the constitutional provision that the president can only serve for 2 terms. He got rid of that in March 2018. I sort of debunked that view as early as 2008 in my book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, and the new edition is coming out next year, and I'm updating the book to include the Xi Jinping era. In that book, I showed that there have been substantial reversals both politically and economically in China, even before Xi Jinping. Right? Xi Jinping basically continued this reversal, but he was not the person who started with the reversal. So let me walk you through some of the evidence and some of the logic of the reversals. I think the more correct view of Chinese politics is that politics have a what is known as exogenous. Politics is exogenous. It is independent. It exists independent of economics. It is not a slave to economics. It has its own dynamics, it has its own forces and things like that. And there have been many, many episodes of reform reversals, right? So that gives you a less optimistic view about China, which is that the prior reforms do not guarantee future reforms, right? They have to be done through what is known as human agency. The leaders have to make decisions. They are not kind of enslaved to the decisions by prior leaders. So the fact that you had reformist leaders before, it doesn't mean that you're going to have reformist leaders today or in the future. And economic reforms have had almost no effect on mechanisms and structure of politics, right? Contradicting the engagement theory, which is that as the economy develops, then you change the politics. And there have been multiple episodes of reform reversals, and this is all based on academic research. Some of it I have done. In rural finance, there have been substantial reversals in China in the 1990s and 2000s. State ownership, China privatized, but China also established many new SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And recently, there have been restrictions on capital flows, on FDI, and on currency convertibility and things like that. There are multiple episodes of reform reversals. And there's a measurement issue, right? So Nicholas Lardy, an economist at the Peterson Institute, estimates that 70% of the Chinese GDP is generated in the private sector. The problem with that measure, so basically his argument is China is already a capitalist society. Look at 70% of the GDP share generated in the private sector. The problem with that measure is that it conflicts 2 effects. One is the policy effect, and the other is the efficiency effect. Because private sector is so much more efficient than the state-owned enterprises, even though you can have anti-private sector policies, that share can still rise simply because private sector is very, very efficient. So when economists use 70% to say, oh, China basically is a liberal economic system, That's just not true. It's really about efficiency of the private sector rather than about how liberal the policy is. The right measure should be factor market, right? Land, which is completely owned by the state, and capital allocation, which is substantially intermediated by the state-owned banking system. Labor, arguably, is more free and more market-based. So I want to make a distinction between the product market, which is substantially private-driven, substantially liberal, and the factor market, which is substantially driven by the state policies. And then if you benchmark China against other countries, right, 70% of the GDP in the private sector, employment share is about 80% by the private sector. Then you ask the question, is that high or low, right? You will say probably they are very high. 70% sounds like a very high number. 80% sounds a very high number. They're absolutely high in the sense that compared with centrally planned economies, remember China in 1978 was a centrally planned economy. Those numbers were zero, right? Even an MIT professor knows that to go from 0 to 80%, that's a pretty big jump. The problem with that view is that there were a lot of other countries that have very high private sector share of the GDP, private sector share of the employment. Let me name these economies, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? They are all very, very private sector driven, right? But if you look at who they are, right? India, Mexico, Philippines, these are the data from the 1970s, right? None of them turned out to be high-performing economic powerhouse, right? So that gives you immediately a takeaway, which is high private sector share of the GDP is a sufficient condition for economic growth. It's not it is a necessary condition for economic growth. It's not a sufficient condition for economic growth, right? There are other things that you have to do right on top of the private share of the GDP to get the GDP to take off. So China arguably is where these countries are, but that's not a guarantee that it is going to continue to grow. It depends on other things. I would argue it depends on rule of law, depends on institutional reforms, and things like that. Then let me talk about the politics of state capitalism. The way that and this is in my forthcoming edition of my book, the way I interpret the last 35 years of the reforms, political reforms, is that in the 1980s, China was governed by a political oligopoly, right? There were multiple centers of the power, and they competed with each other, right? Deng Xiaoping on the one hand, and Chen Yun on the other hand. Deng was a reformer, Chen Yun was a conservative. Essentially, what that arrangement did was there was a de facto check and balance. So nobody could kind of go out of the line too much. Right? That was actually a very good system because you cannot carry out extreme policies because there's an intrinsic check and balance. In the 1990s, there was a arrangement, political duopoly, so only two leaders were left. Right? The problem with the 1980s arrangement is that people die, and even Chinese political leaders, they die, although they live to a very, very advanced ages, but they still die. So they die off, right? And after they die off, there are only two leaders left, right? But they still kind of check and balance each other, so you can't really get the policy too much out of the whack. Today, there's only one guy. There's sort of a political monopoly era. And I worry about that, right? I don't worry about 1980s because there's a check and balance. I worry less about the 1990s because there was still some check and balance, right? So remember, the principle of democracy is check and balance. Chinese did it through personalities. US does it through institutions, right? But the logic is the same, right? There is check and balance. Today, there is absolutely no check and balance whatsoever. So this is a conversation between a village leader and a farmer. The village leader said to the farmer, "Good news, the chairman of the party, chairman of the state, chairman of the military, the leader of the foreign affairs task force, leader of this, leader of that, financial reforms group, they're going to visit your household, right? The farmer said, good, but I don't have so many chairs. Village leader said, don't worry, you only need one chair, right? By some Chinese estimation, Xi Jinping has some 26 titles, right? 26 titles. Probably he has very, very high IQ. But I don't know a country with 1.3 billion people to be entirely trusted to the wisdom of one person. I don't know if that's a good situation. And we actually have done some measurements of the distribution of political power through the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and today. Just to cut the long story short, what this graph shows is that in the 1980s, right, there was power sharing among sort of three factions within the Chinese government. In the 1990s, there was less of that. There was basically power sharing between the two. And then this is today, right? This is today. There's just one person, Xi Jinping. And I call this graph Finding Chinese Wordle. The blue line down below, okay, so I don't know how to make this laser pointer work. The blue line down below is an indicator showing the presence of Chinese prime minister. Right? The line above is the party general secretary. Right? Essentially, what you see is in the 1980s, the two shared power with each other. Right? The indicators were about the same in terms of their value. Now the Chinese wordle has completely disappeared. Right? So increasingly, power is gravitating toward one person. Then there are two competing perspectives. One is that actually having a strong person, and when I go to India, I heard this argument a lot, right? Chinese can reform because they can concentrate their political and policy capital on getting one thing done, and India should emulate China. So the idea is that strong man can push forward reforms better than a democracy. The other view is the opposite, which is that liberal politics tend to go together with liberal economics. And I show this in my book, and as well as in the current future edition of my book. The weight of the evidence from China overwhelmingly supports the second view. When you have liberal politics, you have liberal economics. When you have illiberal politics, you have illiberal economics. So there's no support, empirical support, for the view that you need a strong man to push forward reforms. In the 1980s, that was the most liberal period of Chinese politics, right? Limited political reforms. And to illustrate that, let me tell you the story about three prisoners in a Beijing jail, right? Prisoner A, prisoner B, prisoner C. So one day they started the conversation. Prisoner A said, prisoner B, why are you in jail? Prisoner B said, I'm in jail because I supported Deng Xiaoping. Prisoner A said, oh, this is very strange. I'm in jail because I opposed Deng Xiaoping. Then they turned to prisoner C and said, prisoner C, why are you in jail? Prisoner C said, I'm in jail because I am Deng Xiaoping. So the point of that story is that that's how screwed up Chinese politics was in the 1970s. Right? What Deng Xiaoping did was he moved Chinese political system away from this screwed up situation. And that, to me, constitutes a very important piece of political reforms, right? To make politics more predictable, to run the policies and the decisions on predictable rules of the games, right? So I'm Chinese, I have high standard on food, I have low standard on politics, right? To me, this is real political reform. And that's what happened in the 1980s. We have also done textual analysis of debates in China in the 1980s. There was a lot of skepticism in the official pronouncements, right? Usually we associate sort of a lack of certainty in your statements with liberal politics. They began to admit entrepreneurs into the Chinese Communist Party as early as 1979, right? And then there was an intra-party democracy, right? Chinese people don't get to elect their leaders, but within the party, within the Communist Party, there was substantial democracy. Right? Not substantial, but there was quite a bit of democracy. That was in the 1980s. And the reforms, economic reforms in the 1980s were also fundamental and far-reaching. The great reversals happened in 1989, right? And many of you will probably remember what happened, Tiananmen. They stopped all the intra-party democracy. The meritocracy began to be the operating principle. Essentially, the leaders were judged on KPIs, right? Metrics devised by the central government. And the fiscal decentralization that they started in the 1980s, they were all reversed. There was a substantial financial re-centralization in the 1990s. People's Congress, National People's Congress, the Chinese equivalent of US Congress, began to get some power in the 1980s, but all their power was taken away in the 1990s. And the signature event was the passage of the Three Gorges Dam in 1993. Right? That was the signature event that pivoted Chinese politics toward more centralization. And then now we have the emergence of the strong man, Xi Jinping. Let me talk about the economics of state capitalism. And so essentially I gave you a very brief overview of what happened in politics. Let me talk about the economics. The way that I define state capitalism, a working definition, is that the state's control rights substantially exceed the state's revenue rights. Right? So we distinguish between control, right? How many board members that you have on a corporation, right? Usually the board members, the number of the board members roughly are a proxy of the investment shares that you make in a company. In China, think about the following situation. You have 0 equity shares, but you control all the managers. You appoint all the managers, right? Essentially, this is what is happening in China today. The government does not necessarily own companies, yet the government can affect strategically and operationally the decision-making of private sector companies. That's why that 70% of the Chinese GDP generated in the private sector is not as meaningful as it sounds. Right? It tells us about the revenue rights. It doesn't really tell us about the control rights. Right? And under Xi Jinping, the control rights by the state have increased substantially, even compared with the period before. So let me talk about the state capitalism. There's a substantial government controls of economy and society. Control exceeds the revenue rights of the state. Private sector is large, vibrant, but heavily reliant on government connections. And this is what is known as commanding heights model. The state controls are in the energy, banking, infrastructure, and vital sectors, right? And then there's a division of labor between the state sector and the private sector. The state sector basically controls the upstream sectors of the Chinese economy, right? Energy, raw materials. And the private sector is more prevalent in the downstream sector of the economy, retail stores and manufacturing places like that. Essentially, the way that the state sector makes money is they use their monopoly pricing power to extract rent from the downstream sector, which is the private sector, in order to make money. So let me go through this very, very quickly. The idea, this is going through the intellectual history of state capitalism. The state capitalism goes to, the credit of state capitalism goes to a man called Nikolai Bukharin. He was a Soviet intellectual After Bolshevik came into power, he argued that Soviet Union shouldn't transition directly to communism. It should go through this intermediate phase, what is known as state capitalism, right? And actually, Lenin listened to him and implemented his policies, what is known as a new economic program. But after Stalin came into power, he didn't like his idea, and he executed Bukharin. That's usually how Soviet Union settled these academic debates. The Chinese proponents of state capitalism, all of them also suffered tremendously in the hands of Mao Zedong and others. This person is Liu Shaoqi, the first state president. He proposed state capitalism, and he died during the Cultural Revolution. Bo Xilai, I don't know if anybody in the audience remembers who he was. In 2012, he was vying for power with Xi Jinping. He lost, and he is now in jail. And this is his son, who used to be a Harvard student and Columbia student, who is now exiled in the West. So the proponents of state capitalism didn't do very well, but their ideas have done very well. And this is basically what China is doing today. So the milestones in the 1990s, they essentially implemented financial repression, especially in rural China, massive industrialization, heavy industrialization, launch of massive infrastructure projects, and then coupled with some reforms, such as WTO and privatization of small SOEs, state-owned enterprises. In the 2000s, almost all these reforms disappeared. After the 2008 financial crisis, China launched massive infrastructure building. Infrastructure building is almost completely driven by the government. The powerful government agencies in China now are increasingly those agencies that control the state-owned enterprises, rather than the ones that have to do with private sector companies. So we also have measure of private sector access to finance. And in the 1980s, the blue bar, the blue block represents the private sector access to finance, and gradually the private sector, the purple block, So let me. Okay, so this is the blue block represents the 1980s. The purple block represents the period since 1995, right? So there was a sharp drop in terms of private sector access to finance since the early 1990s. And we have done regression analysis to show you the same thing. We also have done work showing that political connections begin to matter. In the 1980s, political connections didn't matter. Since then, political connections in terms of accessing capital began to matter tremendously. One problem with state capitalism is massive overinvestments, right? And many people celebrate Chinese infrastructure projects. The economic research on infrastructure is actually not as conclusive as many people believe it is. One very good paper shows that infrastructure does not deliver on growth by itself. It has to be done together with human capital investments, right? Think about Belt and Road program now. It is happening in countries that have very low human capital investments, countries like Pakistan, right? My own prediction is that many of these Belt and Road programs are not going to deliver economic returns because they are happening without the comparable human capital investments. In China, it has delivered growth because China has a very high human capital level. So let me show you some pictures of buildings that have been built during this investment drive. And one question is, what are these buildings? Every single one of them is a government building, right? So this is something that many people don't know about the Chinese investment program. A lot of these investments are taking place in the government sector. unless you have a view that these buildings make government work more efficiently, they curb corruption in the government sector, right? Unless you have that view, then you believe these investments are good investments. But I don't think that view is a reasonable view. Usually, government investments are accompanied by massive corruption, by lack of efficiency rather than an increase of efficiency. So even Donald Trump has weighed on the infrastructure quality of China. He says that LaGuardia, JFK are like third world airports. Thomas Friedman has always said something to the same effect. One thing people don't know is that if you measure efficiency of airports, right, measured by on-time takeoff of the flights, the Chinese airports are atrocious. Right? Beijing, only 18% of the flights are on time. Shanghai, a little bit better, 28%. Right? So let me just ask you, as a businessman, do you care about how beautiful the airport looks and how comfortable the lounge is, or even how good the food is? Or do you care that you get to Shanghai on time, right? I mean, I don't know about you. I care about going to Shanghai on time rather than consuming the aesthetics of the airport. LaGuardia and JFK, actually, they don't do so badly. 65% of them take off on time, right? That was not indicated by my own flight last night, which was delayed by 3 hours. Let me go back and revise this in light of new evidence. But I think it's very important to distinguish between two kinds of infrastructure effects, right? One is a construction effect. You build a building, you increase GDP. The other is the efficiency effect, right? Which is that you build the infrastructure that lowers the transaction costs and increases the operational efficiency. My point here is that so far, a lot of the Chinese infrastructure investments have this construction effect on Chinese GDP. They do not have this efficiency effect on Chinese GDP. And that's why I believe that productivity numbers today in China do not look that rosy because these investments have not been associated with productivity growth. So this is a total factor productivity, and what is interesting is that as Chinese urban infrastructure is increasing, the total productivity performance is actually decreasing. Right? These two things are moving in the opposite direction. So in the long run, that scares me. Right? It's the productivity that scares me. It's not the headline numbers such as GDP. So I only have 2 minutes, so let me skip some of these things and then get to the prospects. Let me just mention one thing. The other side effect of state capitalism is that it is increasingly crowding out private sector. Right? So now if you look at fixed asset investments, right, a larger and larger share of the fixed asset investments are taking place among the state sector companies, and the private sector sector is being driven out. Let me skip the governance part of the presentation and talk about the prospects. Right? The economic slowdown is as evident as you can make it to be. And this is an interesting set of statistics. Zhejiang province, which is one of the better performing provinces in China, just reported very proudly that their industrial profits increased by 2.8%. And this is their statistical bureau bulletin. And they say, this is fantastic because we are better than anybody else. By accident, they also disclosed the performance of other provinces. So if you're the best and you're only growing by 2.8%, 2.8% is not that far away from zero, then all these other guys are growing at a negative rate, right? Fujian, Beijing is negative 14%, Tianjin is negative 5.8%, Hebei is negative 11%, Shanghai is negative 19%. Right? The Chinese industrial sector the manufacturing sector. Part of it is trade war. Part of it is self-inflicted policy decisions to constrain the private sector access to capital. The Chinese manufacturing sector is not doing very well, to say the least. GDP growth now is 6%, which is the lowest since 1992. And every time I talk about Chinese data, the question is always, Chinese numbers are overstated anyway. So we need to make a distinction between Chinese statistical falsification during the time of high growth and the Chinese statistical falsification during the time of low growth. Right? What we have shown in a paper with Claire Young is that in the past, the Chinese statistical authorities tend to smooth the data. Right? When the GDP is growing at a very high rate, they actually want to lower the rate. Right? When the GDP growth is slowing down, they want to overstate the rate. So essentially, these two opposite directions make the average number kind of accurate because they cancel out each other. A more recent paper in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activities shows that between 2008 and 2018, even if you take into account these two offsetting effects of the Chinese statistical adjustments, those numbers are overstated by 2%. The way their methodology is, they're looking at other metrics that tend not to be overstated, such as value-added tax, and then correlate the growth with the GDP growth. So the overstatement is about 2%. Let me just conclude by saying that and this is where the Trump shock matters. When you have the slowdown of the Chinese manufacturing sector, of industrial sector, you actually need the external market even more. Right? Many economists will tell you, China has succeeded in rebalancing because their net trade surpluses as a share of the GDP went down from about 8% of the GDP 10 years ago now to 2%. The problem with that statistic is that much of that reduction is absorbed by massive investments. Right? Just trust me with the following statement, and then that's the concluding statement. An investment-driven model is, by definition, an export-driven model, only with a time lag. Right? You invest today, tomorrow it will be an export-driven model. And this is why China is actually extremely vulnerable to the trade shocks, because of the investment-heavy strategy that they have pursued in the past 10 years, and now they are paying for it because the domestic consumption is not keeping up. Thank you very much. What is your view on the situation in Hong Kong? Sorry. So as I said before, China is a complicated country and lots of things are happening. I actually think that in Hong Kong, I'm surprised by the amount of restraints that the Chinese leadership has taken on Hong Kong. And I think there's a reason. The reason is that they do not view the unrest in Hong Kong as fundamentally threatening the legitimacy of their own rule, right? Unlike 1989, when the unrest was happening in the middle of Beijing. So that's point number one. And point number two, which is really a corollary of point number one, is that it is actually very interesting that a lot of the Chinese in mainland China, even the well-educated Chinese intellectuals, tend to support the Chinese government on this, right? Rather than siding with the young demonstrators in Hong Kong. So essentially, when you have nationalists agreeing with you, the government doesn't have an incentive to crack down because they don't view the spillover effect from Hong Kong into mainland China, right? Once that happens, then all the hell is going to break loose. So my prediction is that they are going to be as restrained as they have been, and hopefully the situation is going to quiet down on its own momentum. China and India had the biggest slice of GDP for centuries, and this shift of power to U.S. seems to be a temporary blip. That's often said. I disagree. It is true that at one point China and India together accounted for 50% of the. This is going back to Angus Madison's research, 50% of the GDP and things like that. But this is before technology, right? And which means that if you don't have technology, per capita output is the same globally, right? Maybe I can be 20% more productive than the next guy. I cannot be 4 times as productive or 10 times as productive as the next guy, right? So essentially, the larger share of India and China is driven by the size of the population, right? Per capita GDP is identical. It's not that different. In fact, more recent research shows that as early as 16th century, the Chinese per capita GDP was lower than the Dutch per capita GDP, right? So it's really per capita GDP we care about. It's not the aggregate GDP. Especially, we don't care about aggregate GDP before technology, right? So essentially, India and China got that large share simply because they have a lot of people. A deeper question is, how come those societies were able to support larger base of population, right? Maybe that's an indicator of some superior things that they have. That's a right question rather than this question. I'm not saying you shouldn't ask that question, but as a researcher, I will ask a different question. Can you please explain the success of Alibaba in the era of state? Yeah, okay, that's a very, 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 very good question. Yes, I can. Yeah. In the following sense, I don't know if you know that when Jack Ma tried to register his company, he first went to Shanghai. And Shanghai turned him down. In my book, 2008, I have a chapter, What's Wrong with Shanghai? Shanghai is a state capitalist model of Chinese development. They look at Jack Ma, who are you? You are proposing to do this internet thing. What is internet thing? What they care about is big factories, big automobile, pharmaceutical factories. So he settled in Hangzhou. Right? Hangzhou is the capital city of Zhejiang. I already mentioned Zhejiang. Zhejiang is the least state capitalistic part of China. We have ample data to show that private sector access to capital is the most abundant in Zhejiang. Even land rights are more protective of the farmers than the rest of the country. So essentially, the way to explain this phenomenon is that Alibaba happened in part of China that is least state capitalistic. Right? So if you look at not just Alibaba, you look at other companies, Huawei, success Chinese corporate stories, Huawei, Tencent, and then there's a drone company called the Dajiang in Chinese, DFJ, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest drone companies in the world. They also happen in Shenzhen, one of the least state capitalistic part of China. The biggest, most successful corporate stories in China happen in those parts of China that are least state capitalistic. Right? So essentially, that's my explanation why they have succeeded. Now, there are some interesting issues now. There is rumor that the government wants to take over Alibaba. Right? Also, remember, Alibaba, the early backers of Alibaba were Yahoo, SoftBank, Goldman Sachs, who left too early, and Tencent was backed by a South African company, right? With no backing from the domestic state-controlled financial system, right? So it is not their success is not because of state capitalism. It is because they operated a little bit further away from state capitalism. not having a check and balance could accelerate China's growth, assuming this person is smart and wise. What the probability? Well, I mean, I'm not saying Chinese leaders are not smart and wise. Many of them graduated from Tsinghua, and some people say that MIT is the American equivalent of Tsinghua. And so these people have high IQs. Right? I think the way that I look at policymaking is that China has a lot going for the country. Right? It has entrepreneurship, huge human capital reserve, and the role of women is very, very strong. So all the ingredients for economic takeoff are there. High literacy, right? Hardworking, and technological and scientific knowledge and all of that. The successful formula is for the leadership not to get into the way of that. If you're smart, you tend to think that your decision is better than the market's decision, and you want to substitute your decision for that of the market. That's when you can go wrong. And I believe, I'm not saying that Chinese leaders are not smart, they are extremely smart. But I think we can live with a leader who knows that he or she is not as smart as the market and can sort of let go of some of these decision making. I believe that China will do better under that scenario. Should I? Thank you very much. Yeah.